So welcome to this webinar about nature-based coaching with ADHD adults. Before we start, you might want to grab a pen and a paper. There's going to be some thinking that I'm hoping you're going to do and some self-coaching. So be prepared for that. If now's not the right time, then put a bookmark in it, put it in your calendar with a note maybe, and come back to it. If it is the right time, then great. We could take a couple of breaths together at the very beginning here and maybe look out of the window. See if you can see the sky. Just take a moment to rest, look up at the sky, have a couple of breaths, and then come back. I'll give you that moment now while I wait. Okay, so what we're going to cover briefly, what is ADHD and how does nature support us? We're going to look at the PEACE framework for coaching ADHD adults. And we're going to do that through a self-coaching exercise. So that's where your pen and paper is going to be really important. We'll look at the end, bringing it all together, at how nature-based coaching can really help with ADHD and other neurodivergent people and neurotypical people as well. And there'll be a link for you to download the toolkit on ADHD and nature, which you can use with your clients to hopefully help you feel rather more connected to nature and might be useful in your coaching as well. So let's start with a question. What is ADHD to you? What does it mean to you? Maybe take a minute to write that down on your pen and paper. What does ADHD mean to you? And I thought I'd tell you a little bit about what ADHD means to me, but also what we understand about ADHD from some of the medical and the science world. All of this stuff is open to interpretation. If you have different words that you prefer to use than mine, that's okay. If you have a different view of what ADHD is to me, then that's okay too. We all have different views and perspectives. But perhaps we can just understand other people's views without judgment. So ADHD comes with some real strengths, potentially. So I want to start with strengths rather than challenges, because we too often think about ADHD as a problem. And actually, everyone in the world has strengths, individual talents which can be invested in that become great assets in how we go about our lives. And some recent studies have started to really get under the skin of what people think ADHD strengths are, some quantitative studies. And some of the things that are coming through are that hyperfocus, whilst it can be a challenge, can also be an enormous strength. The ability to get lost in the flow of a task and get a lot done, potentially, really absorbed in it can be a real strength. Secondly, spontaneity is something that people talk about in the ADHD community as a strength. To be able to act on instinct, for example, and to be creative. And there is some research around creativity in ADHD, and it seems that some forms of creativity, particularly sort of early stage idea creation, can be really strong amongst ADHD adults. We're all creative in different ways, whether we recognize that or not, officially, if you like. But some people really feel that that's a strength. Humor is another strength that comes up in the research, and intuitiveness, being able to really read people and situations with an almost uncanny degree of additional sensitivity. And of course, we know that sometimes these things show up in coaching sessions with a shadow side. One of the shadow sides of hyperfocus is procrastination and follow through. Sometimes I'm not really a big fan of the word procrastination. Sometimes it isn't really that. It's really getting started on the thing. Once we start, we're usually fine. The hyperfocus on something we're interested in might not be the same as following through on the thing that actually we need to do, what others are expecting from us. Self-organization and time can be really difficult. Shadow sides of that spontaneity piece, perhaps. That intuitiveness and sensitivity can sometimes mean that people have challenges around self-esteem. Not very surprising, given how difficult society sometimes makes it for ADHD people to thrive all the way from school all the way through to older adulthood. And bound up in that is this idea of rejection sensitivity. Some people talk about rejection sensitivity, dysphoria, an almost bodily pain that comes from rejection, fear of being disliked, criticism, and so on. The challenges that are often described around ADHD are the ones that kind of form part of the classic diagnostics, if you like. So, challenges in attention and focus, challenges in impulse control, and challenges in activity, in the sense that maybe activity that others might deem inappropriate and might be perfectly fine for the person concerned. In a way, all of these challenges are issues of regulation. They're about the brain and particularly the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate processes, regulate the attention of the process of paying attention to something important and not being distracted, to saying no to that impulse that's popped into your head and not following through on it, or moving when you might have the desire to sit but whilst expected to sit still. Another area of regulation that often comes up is not in the diagnostic manual, is emotional regulation. Emotional regulation, the ability to maybe manage our emotions in the minute, in the moment, triggered by events, triggered by circumstances. And of course, challenges also can show up in ADHD coaching in more positive ways. That impulse control can actually be really linked to experimentation. We know that we can feed attention and focus by making things more interesting rather than pretending that they're more important. ADHD really responds well to interest rather than importance. The ability to regulate and get down to tasks can be supported through ideas like body doubling, where the coach might sit with a client whilst they do the thing that they're putting off, or by introducing external signals and triggers of things like time passing, having clocks, having timers, having calendars on the wall, that kind of thing. Sometimes that emotional regulation, that intuitiveness is actually linked to a very strong sense of justice. And that can be a real power. That can be something that we can harness to really give us purpose and meaning in the world. And there's a real strength potentially that comes with that emotional regulation challenge, the strength in sensitivity, strength sensitivity to ourselves, to others, and to the environment, as we shall see. And ADHD is a neurodivergent condition, so called, and it sits in an ecosystem, if you like, of different types of neurodiversity. So neurodivergence is part of neurodiversity. We all have neurodiversity. We all have like, different ways our brains work, different thinking styles, preferences, challenges, and strengths. And it's a bit like this food web here. This is the rangelands of think Northern California when you see this photograph, right? This is a very simplistic but quite powerful way of representing all of the parts of the ecology of that part of the world. All of those parts are necessary. The ecology in Northern California cannot function without the redwood trees, for example, or without the bacteria in the soil or the fungi in the soil that actually allow the trees to harvest nutrients in thin, arid environments. The snakes and the mountain lions and the shrews are all interconnected. We can't do with one without the other. So we could think about ADHD as maybe one or two of the features of this ecosystem. Autism, OCD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, sensory processing traits, Tourette syndrome. These are all aspects of neurodivergence, and they are part of this wider picture of neurodiversity. They're part of life. They make life function. They make life rich and complex and interesting and difficult and precious. So this is something that we can learn from ecology. We can apply it to ourselves, and perhaps that can actually generate in us a sense of validation, belonging, and empowerment. So maybe you could take a minute just to think, which of these parts of this food web do you think represents you, or do you relate to? Okay, so let's look at three slides now that describe different scientific findings and research that show how nature supports us. As I've mentioned already, nature, ADHD is a challenge of regulation. And nature and our exposure to nature actually allows us to regulate ourselves. Nature is a regulating force in so many ways in terms of the climate and in terms of human health and well-being. And one of the key ways that nature does that with human beings is to activate what's called our rest and digest nervous system, our parasympathetic nervous system, if you remember that word from school. And when we become stressed or anxious, we're not in our rest and digest nervous system, we're in our fight or flight nervous system. And we can all imagine what that is like because we've all experienced it. Our heart beats faster, our breath shortens, our muscles contract. We might want to run away. We might want to run towards it and beat it up, whatever it is. And often in modern life, we're in that fight or flight because we're triggered by noise, by pressure, by deadlines at work, by difficult relationships. But when we step outside, something shifts. Maybe at the beginning of this webinar, when you looked out the window, took a few breaths, looked at the sky, something shifted. You're in that rest and digest nervous system place. The key part of that parasympathetic is what's called the vagus nerve or the vagus ventral system, ventral vagus system, in fact. It's a really amazing interconnected nerve that runs all the way from our eyes through to our guts. And it's otherwise known as the love nerve because it helps release important hormones like oxytocin that help us feel safe and calm, but also help us relate to other people, help us trust, help us build relationships, help us converse, right? Think about that when we're in coaching. What we want is our clients to feel safe as possible, don't we? Sometimes if they're in one of those horrible booths in an office in the corner and they know they've got a meeting in an hour and you've got a short coaching session with them, they're not at their best. They're not at their safest, right? That means they're probably less likely to be able to access memory, to trust you, to listen to you, to be able to do all the things that we want clients to be able to do to get the best possible coaching outcomes. Nature works in other mysterious ways, through the colors. If you look at the picture, the sound of the stream, the fractal patterns of the leaves and the branches, the sounds of the birds. All of these things are subtly acting on us, helping us feel calm and activating that vagus nerve. They they affect our attention, right? Because they open up our ability to look around us and engage. They affect our emotion in the way that I've just described, making us feel calmer, safer, happier. And they affect our state of arousal, usually less excitable, usually a bit more centered, a bit more grounded. Doesn't mean we can't run and jump and play and climb trees and have fun. Of course we can. But it's a different kind of arousal than that more stressed arousal that we're trying to avoid a lot of the time. And nature interacts with all three of those systems that are really critical parts of ADHD and some of the challenges of ADHD. And nature supports us in many, many ways related to health and well-being. There's so much evidence of this now. It could be a lecture for a year and we still wouldn't cover it all. The short headline is that living near natural green space is likely to mean that you live a healthier, longer life than if you don't. And that's especially true if you're more disadvantaged from a lower socioeconomic background, working class, marginalized, minoritized community, and so on. You're more likely to have more benefit from growing up near natural green spaces. And loads of studies on this. I'll give you a few just headline ones. There's a really good one just come out recently by Hayward. It looked at a huge range of um, mental and physical benefits that come from access to nature. Essentially, contact with nature is another word that's used in the research. Living near and being with in green and blue spaces. There was a study by Liu that used the UK Biobank, which houses about 500,000 adults worth of health and biological data. And they showed that green and blue spaces in the natural environment lower the risk of a whole range of psychiatric disorders in the population, especially for things like dementia and psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. Another study by Geary, 2023, looked at 2.5 million Welsh adults over a 10-year period. They looked at where those people lived. They used satellite imagery to look at the greenness of their neighborhoods and how many of them and how often had a referral to a GP for a common mental health condition. And they found that those people that lived near green space had more exposure to green and blue space and who spent more leisure time there had significantly less mental health challenges than others. Again, it's particularly strongly beneficial for the disadvantaged communities in Wales. And just to bring it home, just to give you this sort of a visual sense of it, you imagine the neighborhood where you live. If you were to make that greener across the whole of your neighborhood to the equivalent of a basketball court size, right? It's about 500 square meters. Your neighborhood would have about 20% lower odds of having common mental health disorders than if you didn't have that extra bit of greenness. So really quite phenomenal impacts from really quite a modest investment in green space. And why am I talking about mental health when we're talking about ADHD anyway? Well, that's because they're inextricably linked in all sorts of ways. ADHD is very strongly linked to mental ill health. ADHD adults are about 50% likely to experience anxiety at some point in their lives, and that's around 7% more than the general population. So if we can get this right in terms of access to nature, we'll benefit mental health, we'll benefit ADHD adults, and we'll benefit everybody else as well. So last slide of this topic area, let's look at a couple more studies that looked at ADHD more specifically from a population point of view. And one of the first people to look at this in terms of the risk and management of ADHD and how green space helps us was Donovan in New Zealand. This is a picture, an aerial photograph of part of New Zealand on the screen. What they did was they tracked every child born from 1998 all the way through till they were 18 years old in the whole of New Zealand. It's about 50,000 children. They tracked each child's exposure to green space throughout that time, and they measured that by using satellite imagery. And they worked out whether that each child in that cohort had a diagnosis at some point in their 18 years for ADHD. And they were able to make some very strong conclusions that the more rural, the more greener the neighborhood the children were growing up in, the less likely it was that they were receiving an ADHD diagnosis. I find that really interesting. What does it mean? It might mean that green space actually prevents, in inverted commas, ADHD. It might mean that they would have had challenges of concentration, inattention, impulsivity, and so on if they uh, weren't in that green area. Or it might mean that perhaps they still have ADHD in some way. They still have neurological differences in the way their brains work, but nature helps them to manage that growing up, helps them to manage that day to day, which sort of echoes back to some of the findings on the previous slide. Um, we've looked at studies have looked at ADHD in children and how access to nature, for example, in school playgrounds or on specific research projects, improves ADHD symptoms and management, and it does. There was a systematic review by Tillman in 2018 that looked at that. And not only did it help the children um, get on better with their day, but actually there was evidence of better relationships between the children and the teachers, and also between the children and their parents. There's something about time in nature that makes us more what scientists call pro-social. Others inclined, right? Helpful, generous, neighborly. And that was true across age, ethnicity, gender, background, and so on. Government, unsurprisingly, in this country and elsewhere, have caught on to this a bit, and they now are driving quite hard in a more renewed interest, if you like, in what's called accessible natural green space, ensuring that everyone has the ability to spend time in nature very close to their doorstep. And last year, the UK government's Environmental Improvement Plan published a target that everyone in this country should be able to access a natural green space on foot within 15 minutes of their front door. Around 70% of British people can do that at the moment. Around a third can't. So there's a huge gap still. Some other countries are adopting some similar targets, and the World Health Organization, the United Nations are pushing strongly to get policy adoption internationally. So I've talked a lot there. Maybe we can take a moment to look out of the window again and stretch whilst I bring up the next slide. Okay, so the next part of our webinar is a short self-coaching session. And we're going to be using a nature-based framework that I've developed called the Peace Model or the Peace Framework. And the Peace Framework is based on 5 elements: presence, emotion, appreciation, creativity, and enrichment. And it draws on work that researchers have done, psychologists have done around what is it that makes us feel connected to nature? What are the pathways that we can follow to feel more nature connected? Everybody around the world, no matter what their background. So that underpins this model. Another thing that underpins this model is the coaching competencies set out by the International Coaching Federation, which kind of measure, if you like, the standards and qualities expected of high impact, great outcome coaching work. And the third thing that underpins this model is some work that psychologists have done on the positive psychology of ADHD. That draws back on the strengths stuff that we talked about before. Building on people's strengths is a great way to coach rather than trying to get them to focus on their weaknesses and polish them up. And it's lots of studies have shown that long term, that's much more sustainable, much more likely to be effective, drives healthier organizations, drives happier teams, and so on. The pictures are from the book that I've published called Being in Nature, and each one is linked to a practice from being in nature. And so some practices are going to come in today. If you want to find out more about the practices or get the book, then you'll be able to access a link at the end. So let's start with presence. Let's be present and centered for a moment, like this grey heron. I'm standing up. You might want to stand up with me, or do what you want to do. Sit down, lie down, fly. Um, Grey herons are masters of centering. one leg, right? They can take in everything around them and they can also focus on the water in front of them for that next frog. So let's just get our balance right, left to right. Our feet flat on the ground if possible. Our shoulders back and down. Our head lightly floating off our spine. And let's watch a short film, just of some waves lapping on the shore. And whilst you're watching it, just take a few breaths and I might ask you a question. Let's take a couple of more breaths here. And let's find a topic for your self-coaching. What question, issue, or challenge emerges for you right now whilst you watch these waves? What pops into your head as a bite-sized topic to work on for the next few minutes? When you've got something, write it down, maybe as a question on your bit of paper. Right, let's look at emotion, inspired by Gannett's emotional birds. They pair for life. They have a whole load of amazing breeding rituals. They're loving, they're angry. They're a whole bunch of emotions all wrapped up into one bird. And let's have a think about before I go to that slide, let's see in a minute how that challenge or issue or question you've written down feels. Okay. So my question is, what emotions are linked to that question or challenge that you wrote down? When you think about that question, what feelings come up? You write a couple of those down. When you've done that, let's watch this short clip of a redwood tree. So what shifts or changes about your question or your emotions after you've watched that or had that experience? Write down what shifts or changes or what has shifted or changed. Okay, next. What are you starting to appreciate about your challenge or your question? What could you appreciate about it? This is inspired by a beautiful bird called goldfinch. Maybe write down the answer to that question. What are you starting to appreciate about your challenge or your issue? Now I'll invite you to pick one of these photos that you really like or that stands out to you in some way. What do you appreciate about it? What do you appreciate about it? And this I'd like you to write down the answer to. What does nature appreciate about you? What does the stalk or the tree or the cobweb, the spider, the blossom or the cowslip yellow flower? What do they appreciate about you? Okay, so let's get creative now. Let's see if an answer or a solution emerges to your question or your challenge. We're going to watch another short clip. And as you're watching it, I'd like you to think about how could I creatively address my challenge? How could I creatively address my challenge? Hopefully you've got something down there. How could I creatively address my challenge? And then the last stage of this short self-coach is to think about what would be enriching about your creative solution. What is enriching about your creative solution that you've got there? Perhaps you could write down an answer to that. When you're thinking about enrichment, you might like to think about how would doing that thing, taking that action, be good for you? You might like to think, how would taking that action be good for nature? And then finally, you might like to think, how can nature help you as a resource and a reminder? How can nature help you as a resource and a reminder? So that's the end of our self-coach. What I've hopefully you understand I've tried to do there is demonstrate the peace framework in action, right? Or demonstrate what a nature-based coaching session might look like in action. That doesn't mean these are steps that you have to follow, okay? You can mix them all up. You can do one of them or none of them or all of them in any order you like. It's not prescriptive like that. But hopefully you've got a feeling of what each element is trying to get at. We started with presence, right? The power of just really being in the moment in a grounded and centered way like that heron is a great starting point for us to start to come up with ideas because we're calm, right? We're able to think. When we're in our parasympathetic, our clients will really thrive in that space if we can create it with them. We can do it on screen like this. Obviously, we can do it outside with them too, either walking together or sitting together, or even walking or sitting remotely, which is how I do a lot of my nature-based coaching by headphones, somewhere safe. You contract for that, psychologically safe, physically safe, and somewhere attractive and enjoyable to be, starting with presence. Emotion and that ability for nature to help us regulate emotionally can really allow us to do better thinking in coaching sessions. And that works for the client and for the coach, right? We looked at appreciation and the power of building safety, if you like, and trust, but also belonging through appreciating our inequalities. Maybe in coaching, we can do that in a way that our clients don't experience often in life, especially ADHD clients, especially neurodivergent clients that are othered or told they're different or don't fit in or don't belong, if we can help people find a sense of inner appreciation, it can be incredibly powerful, even life-changing. Creativity, huge scope to be creative in coaching. Coaching is a creative process. All sorts of imagination, I'm sure you'll be able to bring to how you're creative. I'm sure you already are creative in the way that you coach. And being outside opens up even more possibilities. We can work with objects, we can climb over things, we can take different routes, we can run, we can hop, skip, whatever you want to do that helps your clients do their best work. And then we looked at, enrichment. In the International Coaching Federation terms, this is facilitating client growth. What is it that they want to do with their learning in the session that allows them to move from where they are to where they want to be? And that is an enriching process. But we also have the opportunity in nature-based coaching to think, how would that action I'm going to take fit with the bigger system I'm part of? How would it fit with the resources I take from water or food or the way I travel, or how would it impact nature and the communities around me? And this is always on the client terms, right? This is not prescribing to them. It's not telling them what to do. It's not pushing them through a funnel process that sort of puts them in one end and spits them out the other like a perfectly formed sausage. It's not that. But there is I think, a responsibility as coaches to be partnering with the system and all of the stakeholders in the client's world, and not just the client and what they currently think is right within their own head. That's maybe one for another conversation. So you now have a sense of the peace framework. You maybe also have a few other ideas on how you might run nature-based coaching sessions indoors, interactive, and hopefully outdoors, or however you'd like to do it. So we've looked at, in a way, if I was to distill it all down, a way of coaching that creates belonging. Belonging is the fundamental human need. If we don't belong, we don't survive. And in ADHD clients in particular, we need to strengthen that, because so often ADHD people and people with other neurodivergences don't feel that they belong, and therefore can't really thrive in life in the way that they need to. And we belong to ourselves as well as to others, of course. So what are some of the features of the coaching that we've talked about? Just to sum up for you, so you've got them all on one slide. I think some of the features are that this is really empathetic work. It's also compassionate work. It's work that can involve strategy and tools. A lot of ADHD coaching focuses on that, helping people to organize and manage their day and help them hold down their jobs and be successful in life. It is about finding some new strategies, maybe, or tweaking old ones, and maybe some new tools in the toolkit. And that's great. I actually think often it's even more than that. It's deeper work. It's about trust and safety. And as I've said already, about belonging. And working with nature is a great way to facilitate trust, safety, and belonging. If we feel safe in our environments, and we do need to contract with our clients for that, to ensure that any environments we're working with them in are safe uh, places to be. All of this work is draws on positive psychology, as I've mentioned, on strengths, and also on an approach which is nature-based, thinking about systems, thinking about human beings as part of a wider ecology, relationships. It builds on the benefits of nature contact and connection that don't really show up in traditional coaching. So there's a whole load of other ways that we can do great work that are accessible and open to us now as nature-based coaches that aren't otherwise. And if I was to summarize, the way that it supports ADHD clients, I'd do it through 4 Cs. Firstly, it can really recharge concentration. We talked earlier about with a tree in the river, what happens to when we're outside in nature and how it regulates us. And by calming down those prefrontal centers of our brain that are so important for executive function in ADHD, what we find is that we can recharge them, so that when we do need to go back to our desk and get that piece of work done against the deadline that we have been putting off, we're much more likely to be able to do it. And there is starting to be some evidence now that recharging that through what's called soft fascination in nature can allow us then to concentrate on the things that matter to us when we're ready to. Provides calm. We talked about that a lot today. Encourages creativity. Again, that's something that we've talked about. So many creative ways we can bring in through a nature-based approach. And finally, facilitates compassion. Passion is an incredibly important emotion because it's an active one. It recognizes that things are difficult. It recognizes that there is suffering, but it also recognizes the need to do something about it. That's what we are as coaches. We recognize the suffering of our clients. However, that is, we're not trying to fix it, but we're trying to resource them to help them to do something about it. And I think that's why we're all here, perhaps. And it's not just me that says so. Here's a few quotes to finish with. From an ADHD and nature coach said that nature reminds us that we can be many things and still be whole, worthy, integral, and part of the bigger picture. Another ADHD coach said, nature has a quiet way of inviting attention back to the here and now, the movement of leaves, the rhythm of breath, the feeling of feet on the ground. These simple sensory experiences can help calm the mind, reduce distraction, and create the conditions for deeper reflection. There we are. They said it far more eloquently than me. And then finally, from a member of the public who's been using the ADHD toolkit, what they said is it really helps them with their ADHD, allowing what I need at the time, finding a way to ground me to the now. So I wonder what you've learned. Maybe you'd like to write down what you will take away to experiment with in your practice. What's your next step after listening to this webinar today? And then if you'd like to know more, you can find me at these links here, and you can download the ADHD toolkit on that using that QR code. It's free. You'll get it by email, and that will also subscribe you. So you'll be able to get a whole load of other free resources as a member of the lateral coaching community. And of course, you can unsubscribe at any time, but I hope that you don't and enjoy it. And if you have any feedback from listening to today's webinar, please email. I'd love to hear from you. And have a fantastic experience in the nature coaching circle. Thanks.